I always have to begin by correcting Eric somehow. There is never ample time for questions and answers. William James, one of the few philosophers who knows how to write, said that most of philosophy is meaningless because their questions don't make a difference. Which way you answer the question, if it makes a difference, makes the question meaningful. If not, not. He gives the example of a hunting expedition he was on with two other philosophers. They sat down and watched two squirrels chase each other around the tree. Philosopher A said to philosopher B, each squirrel circumambulates the tree, right? Right, said B. Does each squirrel also circumambulate the other squirrel? No, said B, because they're always in motion and neither of them ever catches the other or stays still. Oh, yes, they do, said A, because circumambulation is a transitive relationship. If you circumambulate the tree, you must circumambulate each other. Not so, said B. They argued for a half hour, stalked off in opposite directions, calling each other hopeless dunderheads, and vowed never to speak to each other again. William James said, I think I have just seen the history of Western philosophy. Many questions don't make a difference. For instance, Hegel, that paragon of meaninglessness, said that time is not noumenal but phenomenal. It's not really, really real. It's only apparently real. One philosopher, G.E. Moore, said, I would like to ask Hegel, does that mean that I didn't really eat my lunch after I ate my breakfast, but only thought I did? If he says that, he's insane. If that's not what it means, then why does he use such fancy words to say what we already know? I like that kind of simplicity. Socrates had it. And if there's any question that makes a difference and is therefore very meaningful, is the question, is there a God? Here we are on a stage. Did anybody write the play? Or are we ad-libbing our lines? That's obviously a question that makes an enormous difference. Many atheists know that it makes a difference. Sartre says, the atheists of the French Revolution thought that God didn't make a difference. We want to discard this unscientific hypothesis. But meanwhile, we must get on with the business of living, which is to be good to each other and to seek the truth and to have children and to keep the human race going. Why, says Sartre? He prefers Dostoevsky. If there is no God, then everything is permissible, but nothing is meaningful. It makes a difference. Freud, another atheist, knew that the existence of God made a difference. He classified religious faith as a species of insanity, collective insanity, which of course it is if it isn't true. Imagine Jimmy Stewart in that old movie, Harvey. He believes in this 16-foot-high invisible rabbit, Harvey. He's the most important person in his life. He always consults Harvey before he makes a decision. He talks to Harvey. Harvey doesn't exist. Well, if you believe in God and God doesn't exist, you're more insane than Jimmy Stewart, because God's more important than Harvey. So obviously this makes a difference. Different kinds of gods make different kinds of differences. The bigger the god, the bigger the difference. The pagan gods make differences. If you believe in Neptune, you might placate him so that you can survive a storm at sea. But if there's one God who is omnipotent and created the universe, then he makes all the difference in the world. The difference between non-being and being, that's an infinite difference. If a God can bring you from danger to safety or from disease to health, that's a pretty big difference. But if a God can bring you from non-existence to existence by the act of creation, well, that's an infinite difference. So the most important question is the existence of God, and the most important kind of God is the Judeo-Christian Muslim God who creates the entire universe, who makes an infinite difference. So let's talk about whether such a God exists. Can you prove that God exists? Yes and no. All proofs have limits. To prove that I exist, that's rather more difficult than you might think. To prove that this podium exists, that's quite possible. But can you prove everything about the podium or about me or anything else? Well, no. You can only prove a slice of something. And that's certainly true of God. And I think the slice of God that you can prove exists is a very thin slice indeed. It's enough to refute the atheist, but I don't want to give anybody false hopes. I do not think that you can prove everything the Bible means by God. But I do think that you can prove that a being exists that has some of those attributes. If there is a God, then he must be to us something like we are to a snail or a slug. And we must know about as much about him as the snail or slug knows about us. So if we're to know any more than that thin slice, he has to take the initiative. Thus, the notion of a divine revelation and of the human belief in a divine revelation, faith and revelation are correlative terms like color and sight. Faith simply means believing in a revelation. The notion that God has revealed himself and that it makes sense to believe in the things that he has revealed, even though you can't prove them, that in itself is a reasonable notion, although I don't think it can be proved. But it's a reasonable notion because if you use an analogy and look at all the things in the universe in a kind of a hierarchy, you find that if you're thinking simply about an idea, like a mathematical number, then you have total control of the situation. It can't do anything. If you're thinking about a thing that's real, independent of your consciousness, like a rock, well, all the activity is on your side. The rock can't move away and hide and lie to you, but there's a lot of stuff about the rock that you don't know. Then if you look at a living thing, like a plant, you can't totally predict what it's going to be tomorrow, at least not as well as what the rock's going to be tomorrow. So that's even harder to know. Then when you come up to the animal level, well, you have to win the confidence of an animal before it'll reveal itself to you. Some people have a way with animals, some people don't. When it comes to another human being, the activity is 50-50. If you want to know somebody, that somebody has to freely choose to reveal themselves to you, and you have to freely choose to be open to them. When it comes to a creature superior to a human being, like an angel, most of the activity has to be on the side of the superior. Finally, when it comes to God, all the activity has to be on God's part. Now, that activity, I think, is twofold. First of all, God creates you and gives you a mind, which is by nature capable of reasoning back to its creator. Even Frankenstein could do that. But then God also supplies needed to know information that the mind in its present state is inadequate to perform. Thus, the notion of religious faith and the notion of natural reason both fit into the scheme, into the hypothesis that there is a creator God. Another consequence of that hypothesis is that nothing in faith and reason can ever contradict. There cannot be, in principle, a single contradiction between anything that can be proved by the proper use of natural human reason and the things that are proposed for belief by God by divine revelation. If you find a single such contradiction, the hypothesis is refuted. That makes the biblical God very vulnerable to disproof. He's still around, though. I don't think, however, that he is sitting with bated breath waiting to see the cogency of my proofs tonight so that he knows whether he exists or not. What kind of proof am I talking about? Well, let's distinguish a number of different questions. First of all, whether God exists. A thing can exist without us knowing it. Secondly, whether we can know that God exists. A thing can be known without there being certain knowledge. Thirdly, whether that knowledge is certain. But a thing can be certain without you being able to prove to someone else that certainty. For instance, I am certain that I exist, but I don't think I can prove to you that I exist. You may disagree. I think Descartes failed. Fourth, you may be able to prove a thing with certainty, but the proof is not yet a scientific proof. The scientific method is probably the greatest invention in the entire history of science. It's like a skeleton key that enables us to make all the other discoveries. But not everything follows the scientific method. You cannot prove that your wife or husband loves you by the scientific method. You cannot prove that life has any meaning whatsoever by the scientific method. You cannot prove that beauty is better than ugliness by the scientific method. So I do not think that you can prove that there exists a God by the scientific method. Some people may disagree with that, but I do think you can prove that God exists by good logic. There's two extremes then. The rationalist extreme is to either prove everything about God or claim to prove God by the scientific method. I don't think that can be done. The irrationalist extreme is it doesn't matter, it feels nice, so I'm going to believe anyway. There are various kinds of proofs. There's a practical proof and a theoretical proof. A practical proof doesn't prove that God exists. It simply proves that it's practical to believe in him. The most famous of these is Pascal's wager. I'm going to give 7 proofs for the existence of God tonight. That's the first one. The second kind of proof is theoretical proof. Proof that proves that something is the case, whether it's practical or not. To quote William James once again, there's 2 kinds of people in the world, the tender-minded and the tough-minded. The tender-minded put practice above theory. The tough-minded put theory above practice. The tender-minded think that happiness is the most important thing. The tough-minded think that truth is the most important thing. The tender-minded start with their own feelings. The tough-minded start with facts. It seems to me that good philosophers are all tough-minded. So I'm not going to give any tender-minded proof. However, some proofs are only probable and some are certain. I will give one probable proof. That might be a contradiction in terms, if you mean by a proof a certain demonstration. But the proof that's often called the argument from common consent, I think, is a very reasonable reason for believing in God, even though it doesn't prove that God exists. The other proofs, I believe, are certain. I know of at least 24, probably 4 dozen, proofs for the existence of God that claim to be certain. I think at least half of them are valid. I don't think, by the way, that Anselm's ontological argument is valid, but I do think that, well, the following 5 proofs are valid. Number 1, the argument from the first cause, or the contingency argument. Number 2, the design argument. Number 3, the moral argument. Number 4, the argument from desire. And number 5, the existential argument. The 5 proofs of Thomas Aquinas all fit under the first cause or contingency argument. But before we get to those 5 proofs, let me very briefly review arguments that are practical and arguments that are probable. Pascal's wager is my students' famous, their most popular proof. They like it the best. That proves nothing. They're in Massachusetts. But there are more philosophers, however, in Boston per capita than any other city on earth. The reason is philosophy is the love of wisdom, and wisdom comes from suffering. Somebody said to me, why do I wear this in New York? Do I have a death wish? And I say, no, I meet Yankee fans and we get along famously. I just say, we all know our place. I am the masochist, you are the sadist. There are certain things, like the law of non-contradiction, that are absolutely certain. Pascal's wager is an argument for skeptics, for those who don't think there's any good proof for or against the existence of God, so they wonder, since they have no tough-minded argument, whether there's a good tender-minded argument. And Pascal says there certainly is. It's a bet. What can you win? There's 2 things everybody wants, truth and happiness. According to the skeptic, you can't find the truth about God, no matter how hard you try. Well, let's calculate on happiness then. If there's a God, and if you believe in him, then you attain eternal happiness. That's a good bet. However, suppose there's no God. Well, then if you believe in him, it doesn't do you any harm. There's no payoff. There's no winning or losing after death. But if you don't believe in him, then, once again, if there is no God, it doesn't do you any harm. There is no life after death, no heaven or hell. But if there is a God, does it do you any harm? Well, suppose I say, I have here $1 million, and I'll give it to you for free if you come and take it from my hand. And if you don't trust me, you don't have $1 million. You've lost something that's enormously valuable for no reason at all. In other words, the only possible combination of winning is, number 1, God in fact exists, and number 2, I believe in him. The only possible way to lose is, number 1, God exists, and number 2, I refuse to believe in him. If God doesn't exist, then you don't either win or lose in the next life, when you will find out, and nobody can prove whether you're winning or losing in this life, if you're a skeptic and you don't think you can prove God exists or not. So, since the only possibility of winning is to believe in God, and the only possibility of losing is not to believe in God, belief is the world's best bet. Now, that's very crass and crude and selfish and has almost nothing to do with religious faith, except that it'll scare you away from atheism. And God, who is love, stoops to conquer. And he will accept even the most ridiculous of our attempts to come to him. Second, the argument from common consent. This is seldom given anymore, and I'm surprised at that, because in the past, when human consciousness and human society was hierarchical rather than egalitarian, it was a very popular proof. Whereas today, when almost everyone is egalitarian and suspicious of hierarchy, it's hardly ever given. The argument is, the vast majority of all human beings in all times, places, and cultures have believed in some sort of a God. Therefore, it is very likely to be true. Or to put it differently, in order to be an atheist, you must be a snob. You must believe that you stand among the very small minority who are liberated from mankind's most pervasive superstition. That doesn't prove anything, but at least it ought to make you worry a little bit. Now let me go into the 5 serious arguments for the existence of God. The first cause argument is in one sense very simple and in another sense very complicated. The simple form is this. Let us define a first cause as an absolutely first cause, an uncaused cause, something that causes other things but is not itself caused. If there is a God, God would be a first cause. A creator is by definition a first cause of everything but himself. Now, either there is a first cause or not. If there is no first cause, then there are no second causes either. Because second causes operate only if they're caused by a first cause. Whether there's only one second cause, or a finite number, or even an infinite number. Think of a train. The locomotive pulls the cars and itself. The cars can't pull themselves, they can only pull each other, but they can pull each other only if they're pulled by the locomotive. If there is no locomotive, there can't be a train, whether there's one car or 10 or 1,000,000. So unless there is an uncaused cause, there can't be second causes. That seems to be a logical principle. You can deduce that simply by an analysis of the meaning of the word cause. The second premise is a sense observation. There are second causes. There are caused causes. In fact, the entire universe is an enormous 18 billion year long series of trains or dominoes or caused causes. Well, put the two premises together. If no first cause, no second causes, there are second causes, therefore there must be a first cause. First doesn't necessarily mean temporally first. This piece of paper is being held up by this podium. The podium exercises a causal effect on the piece of paper. It prevents it from falling down. But the podium doesn't exert its causality first in time, and then after it finishes, then the paper begins to be held up. The cause and the effect are simultaneous. So God doesn't have to be in time in order to be the first cause. He could be the simultaneous giver of existence to everything that exists. Another version of this argument is the contingency argument. That's a little more abstract. One way of formulating it is this. A thing exists, and a thing has an essence or a nature. I exist, and I have human nature. A horse exists, and it has the nature of a horse. A unicorn does not exist, but it has the nature of a unicorn. Now, nothing exists simply because of its essence. A unicorn has a perfectly good essence, and so does a horse. But a horse happens to exist, and a unicorn doesn't. Because whatever forces brought a horse into existence, but didn't bring a unicorn into existence. We see nothing in the universe, and we can imagine nothing in the universe whose essence accounts for its existence. Therefore, everything in the universe is contingent on something else with respect to its existence. Analyze its own inner being, and you'll find this distinction between its essence and its existence. Now, if there is a God, God is not a creature, but the creator. So God does not receive existence from anything else. He is not contingent on some other being for his existence. Nevertheless, he exists. Therefore, he must exist by his own essence, necessarily. Now, is there such a God? Well, if not, then everything in the universe is contingent for its existence on nothing. If you say, but I was given existence by my parents, and they were given existence by my grandparents, and so on, you still haven't accounted for anything, not even my existence. That's like meeting a large iron chain suspended in midair and saying, why in the world doesn't it fall? And you see another link that's holding it. You don't stop there. You say, why are both links held up in the air? And then you look and you see a third link above it. And you don't stop there until you find out that there's a large crane on top of a building, which is perched on the ground, which is holding that chain. But until you have something that explains itself, so to speak, you don't explain anything else. It's dependent on that something. That's probably the most abstract of all the arguments for the existence of God, but perhaps also the most profound. Aquinas tries to put it in a very concrete way, and I'm not sure whether this way is valid or not, but let me give it to you, just because it's so concrete in the other expression. If there is a necessary being, a being that has to exist, it exists eternally. It cannot ever lose its existence. That would be God. Now, everything else has the possibility to cease to exist. Everything in the universe can die. Now, if there is no God, then there is infinite time. There's no creator, therefore no act of creation, and therefore infinite time for every possibility to be actualized, including the possibility of death for everything. Well, if there's already been infinite time, then every possibility has already been actualized, so why hasn't everything already died? And once it dies, it'll never start up again. I'm not sure whether that's valid or not, but it's at least concrete. Incidentally, scientific confirmation of something like the contingency argument, I think, has come through Big Bang cosmology. 20 or 30 years ago, scientists were divided into three groups as to the origin of the universe: the steady statists and the oscillation theorists and the Big Bangers. And the steady state theorists said the universe has always been here. The oscillation theorists said that the universe continually expands and contracts like an accordion. And the Big Banger said there has been just one Big Bang, and ever since the universe has been expanding. Well, nobody is a steady statist or an oscillationist anymore. Everybody's a Big Banger. And if there's a Big Bang, there must be a Big Banger. The argument from design is probably the single most popular and comprehensible argument for the existence of God. I met a doctor once who worked in Zaire for a while, and he had to make his way into a tribe that was suspicious of outsiders, and he won their confidence and saved their lives, so he was the Great White Father. And they asked him all sorts of questions about life in the West, and they asked him, do you have wise men there? They said, yes, we call them philosophers. Oh, what do they believe about the gods? Well, many of them are atheists. What's that? They didn't have a word in their language for that. That means they don't believe in any gods at all. No gods at all? Not one and not many? Not male, not female, not in the earth, not in the sky? Not good, not evil? No gods at all? There are people who believe that? And they buzzed around themselves like bees and said, how can this be? And they finally came up with a solution. These people are blind and dumb and deaf, right? They live in cellars all their lives. They have never seen a star or touched a leaf. No. There are many very simple and comprehensible versions of the design argument. If you walk down the street and notice the Empire State Building, you don't say, gee, it just happened. How about that? It just evolved. Even a thing like a watch obviously presupposes a watchmaker. Well, there is much more design in the universe than in a building or in a watch. So by analogy, it seems that the universe requires a universe builder. That analogy may be weak. No analogy in and of itself is an argument. But Aquinas' version of it, I think, works better. He says that when many beings with diverse natures work towards a common end, we can be sure that there is intelligent design behind that. If there's just random motions of the sand on a beach, that's just the wind. But if the motions make a sandcastle, we know that somebody built it. Or if there's a message, SOS, we know that somebody made it. Well, there certainly is more design in a single cell of your body than there is in any human artifice. I saw a survey once of scientists in the various sciences. They were asked, do you believe in a creator God? And the percentage who believed in God among astronomers, astrophysicists, and cosmologists was something like 90%. Also a rather large number among cell biologists. And as you get into the human sciences, it decreases until you finally get into psychiatry and sociology, where the percentage is very small. I think that's quite to be expected. The more you get into human undesign, the harder it is to see God. The more you get into natural design, the more you do see God. Many religious believers see evolution and the theory of natural selection as a threat to the design argument. I've never understood that. It seems to me that a God who wanted to play with the universe with a light hand and remain anonymous most of the time and use second causes or creative causes to do his work might very well use exactly something like natural selection to bring about the human body as nature's most perfect product. So, if anything, evolution seems to increase and make more reasonable the argument from design. The thing that is the most carefully designed thing in the universe is the human brain. We haven't yet made a computer that's quite that efficient. Now, the brain is very much like a computer. If you were riding in an airplane and the public address system said, there is no pilot, but this airplane is piloted by a computer, which has been programmed by a football player trampling over computer cards with spiked shoes this morning. You would feel perfectly content, right? No, I think you would pray. Or, this airplane has been programmed by a computer which was programmed in the following way. The keyboard was left out in a field last night, and there was a hailstorm, and the hailstones hit the typewriter keys. Again, you would not put much confidence in that plane. Well then, why do you put confidence in your brain to understand the universe and to do science if your brain is simply a product of mindless chance? 20 million years ago, there was no intelligence anywhere in the universe, as far as we know. And no one seriously maintains that the solar system was designed by extraterrestrials. So, if all intelligence now is totally caused by the mindless, pointless, and purposeless and accidental colliding of atoms, then why do you trust it? These arguments from the cosmos, I'm going to get into arguments from human experience in a moment, are less interesting to us, most of us anyway, than arguments from human experience such as the moral argument and the existential argument. But they're quite important because the attributes of God that are proved by this argument interface with the attributes of God that are proved by the other arguments. The moral argument, for instance, might prove that God is a moralist. Well, so what? Maybe he's just weak. Maybe he's just a fairy tale. Does he also have the power to create the universe? Is divine goodness and divine omnipotence together in the same God? If so, the consequences are enormous. So let's look at some of the more interior arguments. Arguments may take their data either from the external world or the internal world. There are facts that we observe with our senses, and there are facts that we observe with our interior senses. And one of the facts that we observe with our interior senses is that we all have a thing called conscience. We all make moral judgments. We all judge not merely that a thing is, but that a thing ought to be or ought not to be. That's simply a fact. Well, either moral judgments can be true or false, or they can't. Either moral judgments are simply expressions of feelings which we mistake for judgments, or they are what they seem to be. In other words, either there really is good and evil, or it's all an illusion.